There is a people who do not fit the accepted genetic map of North America, not the physical map of mountains and rivers and reservation boundaries, the invisible map drawn from DNA. For generations, researchers believed they had a reliable answer to the question of Navajo origins. The story sat in textbooks the way settled stories do, quietly, confidently, without generating further questions. Then, in 2003, a group of geneticists extracted DNA from ancient human teeth. What came back from the laboratory did not complicate the story in minor ways. It restructured it from the foundation up. This is not, at its core, a story about ancestry. It is a story about the relationship between certainty and evidence, about how long our conclusions remain confident after the evidence supporting them has quietly shifted underneath, and about what occurs when the biological record finally finds its voice loud enough for the scientific community to hear. To understand why the discovery matters, you have to first understand what the consensus position actually was. The Navajo Nation is the largest federally recognized tribal nation in the United States by land area, with a population approaching 400,000 people distributed across a reservation roughly equivalent in size to the state of West Virginia, occupying the Four Corners region where Arizona, New Mexico, Utah, and Colorado converge. Their language, Diné Bizard, is one of the most linguistically isolated languages on the continent. It is tonal, extraordinarily complex in its verb structure, and shares no meaningful grammatical or phonological features with the Pueblo languages spoken by the communities who have been their neighbors for centuries, nor with any of the older language families of the surrounding Southwest. The established historical account goes like this. The ancestral Navajo descended from subarctic and western Canadian origins, migrating southward from those northern territories somewhere between 1300 and 1500 CE. They belong to a broader grouping that linguists and anthropologists call the Southern Athabascans, a collection of related peoples whose languages trace their family membership back to the large Athabaskan language family spoken across northern Canada, interior Alaska, and parts of the Pacific coast. The Apache share this linguistic heritage. Communities in the Yukon carry the same distant ancestral tongue in a recognizably related form. The southward migration narrative held together well. It was consistent with linguistic evidence. It aligned with oral traditions describing a long journey from a northern homeland. And for several decades it was considered, if not entirely closed, at minimum sufficiently established to serve as the foundation for everything built on top of it. But there was always a friction, a small, persistent point of resistance that the standard model could acknowledge but never quite absorb. The Navajo did not arrive in the Southwest and simply continue. They arrived and were reconstituted. Within a relatively compressed period, following sustained contact with Pueblo communities and Spanish colonial presence, something unprecedented occurred. A pastoral economy built around sheep and horses took shape, both animals borrowed from outside the original Navajo cultural framework. A sophisticated and culturally central tradition of silversmithing emerged, borrowed from Spanish metalworking, then transformed into something recognizably and distinctly Navajo. The loom and its associated weaving techniques were adopted, and then elevated into one of the most technically complex and artistically accomplished textile traditions in the Western Hemisphere. Elements of Pueblo ceremonialism were absorbed into an existing spiritual worldview and synthesized with it rather than simply added alongside it. Borrowing between neighboring cultures is not unusual. It is, in fact, one of the most normal things that cultures do when they occupy shared or adjacent landscapes. What was unusual here was not the borrowing. It was the depth and the velocity of the transformation. The Navajo did not merely collect external influences the way a society might accumulate imported goods. They metabolized them. They produced from diverse and sometimes contradictory cultural inputs something unified, coherent, and entirely their own. A people synthesized from multiple streams into a whole that was more than the sum of its parts. Anthropologists described this process as cultural diffusion. Historians called it adaptive capacity. The framing held for a while. Then the geneticists came in. The first generation of DNA research on Navajo populations, conducted through the 1990s, focused primarily on mitochondrial DNA. the genetic material transmitted exclusively through the maternal line, mother to child without interruption across generations. On the surface, the results appeared consistent with the accepted migration narrative. The Navajo showed haplogroups, the genetic category designations that function as lineage markers, that are broadly shared across indigenous populations throughout the Americas, pointing toward ancestral origins in Northeast Asia and entry into the Americas through Beringia, the ancient land connection between Siberia and Alaska that existed during periods of lower sea levels. But there were irregularities, modest ones at first, haplogroup frequencies that diverged from the expected Athabaskan profile in ways that were small enough to attribute to genetic drift, the random statistical movement of gene variants through small populations over time, and not large enough to force a re-examination of the larger framework. The more significant disruption came when researchers shifted their attention to the Y chromosome, the genetic material that passes exclusively through the paternal line, father to son, carrying its own distinct record of ancestry that runs parallel to the mitochondrial record but independently of it. What they found in the Y chromosome data was not anticipated. It told a different story than the mitochondrial data. And when two separate lines of genetic evidence within the same population point in different directions, that divergence is not noise in the data. It is information. The maternal lineage record suggested continuity. Indigenous ancestry consistent with established migration patterns, pointing backward through the Americas and ultimately to populations in Northeast Asia. The expected narrative broadly confirmed. The paternal lineage record was less orderly. Embedded within the Y chromosome data were haplogroups whose geographic distribution patterns did not align cleanly with other Athabaskan populations. There were genetic signatures indicating admixture events, points in the past where distinct populations came into reproductive contact and merged, that the standard migration model had not accounted for and had not predicted. The asymmetry between the maternal and paternal genetic records was the signal, and it demanded explanation. Three broad frameworks emerged from the research community's attempt to account for what the data was showing. The first is the admixture model, and it is the most conservative of the three. Under this interpretation, as the ancestral Navajo moved southward through the Great Plains and into the southwest over the course of their migration, they encountered other populations along the route and integrated some of those individuals, predominantly men, given where the signal appears, into their community through marriage, alliance, or absorption following conflict. The Y chromosome signatures represent the paternal lines of those men. The mitochondrial consistency reflects the relative stability of the female lineage. The two genetic streams are not contradicting each other. They are recording two distinct histories, one organized around the movement of women and one around the movement of men. The second framework is considerably more challenging for the mainstream archaeological consensus to accommodate. A small number of researchers have proposed that Navajo and certain other Southwest indigenous populations carry genetic traces of contact not limited to other Native American groups, but extending to populations who arrived in the Americas by routes and at times that do not appear in the conventional peopling model. The concept of pre-Columbian transoceanic contact, across the Pacific, across the deep Atlantic, via routes that mainstream archaeology has historically resisted, periodically surfaces in genetic debates when the data produces signatures that the Beringian model struggles to absorb. The evidence is not conclusive, but it has not been conclusively eliminated either. The third framework looks inward rather than outward. It proposes that the founding population of the ancestral Navajo was itself more complex and multi-ethnic than the Athabaskan migration model implies, that the southward movement was not a single unified migration of a culturally and genetically coherent group, but a composite process. Different communities moving at different times along overlapping routes, absorbing each other and being absorbed, arriving in the southwest, carrying a genetic history more layered than any simple migration narrative could represent. Each of these three frameworks contains something that the evidence supports. None of them, individually, resolves all of what the data shows. In 2021, a large-scale genomic study published in the journal Science analyzed ancient and modern DNA collected from hundreds of indigenous individuals across the Americas, including individuals from Southwest populations. The research was conducted by teams at Harvard's Department of Human Evolutionary Biology and the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology. Rather than examining the narrow genetic windows provided by mitochondrial DNA or Y chromosome analysis alone, this study employed whole genome sequencing, the complete biological text rather than selected chapters. The findings were comprehensive, and in several specific dimensions, they were genuinely strange. The research team confirmed what earlier, more limited studies had begun to indicate, that Navajo and related Southwest indigenous genomes carried evidence of multiple distinct ancestry streams that could not be attributed to any single migration event, regardless of how that event was modeled. The genome contained echoes of populations that had moved through the Americas in patterns that did not map onto any existing migration framework with precision. But what distinguished this study from its predecessors was not what it found within the Navajo genome in isolation. It was what the Navajo genome revealed when compared against populations it was not expected to be related to. The finding, and it is a genuinely startling one, is this. An ancient genetic signal detected in some Navajo individuals matched, in part, a population signature that had previously been identified only in ancient DNA samples from the Amazon basin, a region separated from the Southwest by thousands of miles, radically different in environment, unrelated in language family, and historically disconnected in every cultural framework that archaeologists had constructed. This Amazonian signature, sometimes called the population Y signal, where Y stands for the obvious, had already produced significant confusion when it first appeared in South American samples. It had been provisionally associated with a possible ancient migration of people carrying genetic affinities to Australasian or Southeast Asian populations, a movement that may have predated or run alongside the primary founding migration of the Americas and left its trace in isolated pockets scattered across the continent. The emergence of traces of this signal in Southwest samples was not theoretically impossible, but it had not been predicted, and it did not make the picture simpler. What it implied, and researchers chose their language carefully, working in probabilities rather than declarations, was that the founding population of the Americas was substantially more genetically diverse than the dominant model had assumed, that the groups who crossed Beringia were not a homogeneous founding population, that the people who eventually became the Navajo carried, buried in the oldest layers of their genetic record, a thread of ancestry from a migration event so ancient and so distant from the Southwest that it registered only as the faintest statistical residue in the modern genome. The story did not become clearer with more data. It became older and more expansive. Stand in the Chuska Mountains on the eastern edge of the Navajo Nation on a morning in late autumn. The elevation exceeds 9,000 feet. The air is cold, dry, carrying the scent of ponderosa pine. Below the ridge, the red rock formations of the Colorado Plateau extend outward in every direction, further than you can process as a single visual experience. The scale of this landscape has a specific effect on the human nervous system. It reduces the sense of individual significance in a way that is not unpleasant. It is clarifying. The Navajo language contains a word, hozu. It is most frequently translated into English as harmony, or balance, or beauty. But any of those translations in isolation is insufficient, because the word holds all three meanings simultaneously and treats them as aspects of a single condition rather than separate qualities. Hozu describes the state in which all relationships between things are correct, the world operating as it should, every element in its proper place relative to every other element. That word stayed present while reading through these genetic studies. The researchers were searching for Hozu in the data. They were looking for a clean structure, a linear descent pattern, a migration tree with identifiable branches, a story with a recoverable beginning, a traceable middle, and a legible conclusion. And the data kept declining to provide that structure. Not because the data was flawed, because the human story is not a tree, it is a network. A dense web of movement and contact and merger and separation repeated across tens of thousands of years, each phase leaving traces in the genomes of the populations that followed, the way that water moving across stone over centuries leaves marks that tell you something real about where the water came from and how it moved, even when the water itself is long gone. The scientists were searching for order. The data was offering them something more accurate and less comfortable, complexity without the resolution that narrative requires. This matters well beyond the specific question of Navajo origins. Human beings have a deep and understandable need to make the past legible. To say with confidence, this population originated here, these people are descended from those people, the lines of connection run in these directions, the map is readable if you know what you are looking at. That need is not irrational. Narrative is one of the primary tools through which we organize information and transmit it across generations. But what the expanding field of ancient genomics has revealed with increasing consistency over the past 2 decades is that this need for narrative legibility was always partly a projection, a simplification that served human cognitive requirements more faithfully than it served the historical record. The clean migration stories, the singular origins, the coherent founding populations, these were models. Useful models, sometimes approximately correct models, but models nonetheless, built from incomplete data and shaped by the narrative preferences of the researchers constructing them. The Navajo are not simply Southern Athabascans who migrated from Canada 700 years ago. They are not reducible to that story, even as a starting point. Their genomes contain evidence of movements that trace back to the earliest human presence in the Americas, to migration events that preceded any written account by tens of thousands of years, to populations whose names no archive preserves and whose existence can now be detected only through the patterns their DNA left in the people who came after them. Every human population is a palimpsest in this sense, a document that has been written, partially erased, and written again multiple times across deep history, each layer leaving its marks visible to whoever has developed the tools to look at the page beneath the page beneath the page. The Navajo are not unusual in being a palimpsest. They are among the populations whose layers we have most recently begun to read with any seriousness. And what that reading shows is not a reduction of their history or a complication of their identity. It is an expansion of both. The story we thought we knew was too small. It compressed an enormous and ancient human history into a single migration event and called the question settled. The genome is reopening the question, not to destabilize what the Navajo know about themselves, but to add dimensions to that knowledge that were always there, waiting to be recovered. The roots go further down into time than any previous model had mapped. The ancestry reaches across distances and connections that the conventional framework had not thought to account for. The people who carried these genetic threads across tens of thousands of years and thousands of miles to the Colorado Plateau were not simple, were not uniform, were not the product of a single coherent movement from a single point of origin. They were what all human populations are when you look at them with sufficient resolution, the accumulated result of an incalculable number of human encounters across deep time, each one leaving something in the biological record that nothing afterward could fully remove. That is not a mystery that has been resolved by the science. It is a mystery that the science has shown to be deeper and more ancient and more genuinely interesting than the settled account ever suggested, which is, when you think about it honestly, the only direction that real understanding ever moves, not toward simpler answers, toward better questions. The Navajo Nation today spans approximately 17.5 million acres across 3 states. It is home to one of the most intact indigenous linguistic traditions in North America. Diné Bizard remains a living first language for a substantial portion of the population, and active language revitalization efforts are working to ensure it continues into future generations. The ceremonial traditions, the land-based knowledge systems, the weaving, the silverwork, all of it continues, not as preservation of a static past, but as a living culture that is simultaneously ancient and contemporary, rooted in a history that genomic science is only now beginning to trace with the precision it deserves. The genetic research is ongoing. Reference panels drawn from Native American populations are being expanded and refined, a process that requires the active participation and consent of the communities involved, consent that is not guaranteed and not owed, given the history of scientific exploitation of indigenous people and indigenous remains that preceded the current era of research ethics. What each new study adds is not a final answer. It is additional resolution on a picture that is extraordinarily old and extraordinarily complex. Each haplogroup distribution, each ancient DNA sample, each comparative analysis between populations that conventional history would not have thought to compare, each of these adds a line to a portrait that will not be complete in our lifetimes. But the direction of the emerging portrait is clear enough to say this with confidence. The people we call the Navajo are the living descendants of a history so old, so layered, and so deeply woven through the human story of the entire Western Hemisphere that no single migration narrative was ever adequate to contain it. They were never what we thought, because what we thought was not nearly large enough.